to this first issue of aligning the regulations with the plan, one of the key components or policy directions in the plan was the policy direction about supporting more intense walkable urbanism and TOD development around your transit stations and other centers in the community. We really focused on implementing that concept in the zone districts, which I will talk about in a couple of minutes. A second key goal in the plan was to protect the character of established single-family neighborhoods. We have recommended 3 tools, new zoning tools that aren't in your code right now, to address that issue. The first is a set of what we are calling neighborhood compatibility standards. These neighborhood compatibility standards would be in the code. They would include precise, measurable standards or requirements that any multifamily or 2-3 family commercial development that locates adjacent to a single family neighborhood would have to comply with. What do those standards address? Those standards address things like height. In other words, requiring height to be feathered, be contiguous, or I should say contiguous, compatible and consistent with the height of that single family neighborhood when it's very close, and then as it gets further away, then the heights can be increased. It deals with issues like building form for buildings that are also that face the single family neighborhood, location of parking to move parking away from the single family neighborhood, additional landscaping and buffering requirements, roof lines, we call operational standards. In other words, whether or not, or what are the limitations on outdoor dining and things like the operation of businesses beyond certain hours, so that the neighborhood is protected from a lot of noise, and then lighting generally to ensure that there's no glare into the neighborhoods. The second tool we recommend is a much more meaningful and much more specific, what we're calling pre-application neighborhood meeting, which it would be required for developments of a certain size or potential impact before the application is submitted, number one, but also subject to some very clear and broad-based notification requirements, some requirements about the content of the material that the developer has to provide the neighbors at the meeting in terms of an actual concept type plan, shows height, shows general location of the building, general layout of the building. At the conclusion of that meeting would provide a summary of that meeting, which would be part of the application. Now, one of the reasons we recommend, a lot of communities now are using that type of pre-application neighborhood meeting, and we have found it to be very helpful. One of the reasons is it's much easier for a development applicant to make modifications really early in the process, before they spend a lot of money on engineering requirements, before lines are drawn in the sand, then versus after they get into a public hearing process. So that's another important component. And the third component is a recommendation for what we're calling a neighborhood conservation district overlay. This is another zoning tool that an increasing number of communities, especially communities that are very sensitive to neighborhood protection issues, have included in their zoning ordinances. That provision, basically, there would be establish a process by which an individual neighborhood who wants to protect a certain character in their neighborhood, whether it be lot area requirements or height or roof form or sidewalks, could place measurable standards in that district, and any new development would have to comply with that district. So that's been a very successful type of provision. Fourth there was another goal that we identified in aligning with the plan was to establish standards to encourage green development. Green development like alternative energy, energy conservation, urban agriculture. What we found, it's interesting, if you do read the report, is we went through your current regulations and there was very little mention of that, of any green building practices in the regulations. So we're suggesting, number one, that we clearly establish some definitions, some reasonable standards, remove any obstacles to that type of development, and then provide some incentives for anyone who wants to incorporate green building practices. And finally, it was very clear that it's important that the new regulations not be a one-size-fits-all. In other words, that your current regulations do not take into account the different contexts in different places in the community. Places like inside the Beltway, your older built communities are built on much smaller lots. They have different development needs, and one-size-fits-all ordinance does not necessarily, or in a lot of instances, places obstacles for the redevelopment. So what we're suggesting is we'll have different development standards for your older built areas, your centers, your agricultural rural areas, and your other parts of the county, primarily the suburban areas of the community.